Hello, my name is Bob Schut. I am a Bible study teacher. I've been a Bible study teacher for about 5 years. I've taught many of the books of the New Testament. I am a fan of, perhaps that's not the best word, but I love the writings of Kierkegaard. What makes me qualified to teach? I don't know if there's anything that really does make me qualified or make anyone qualified to teach Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is an individual, an author, that it's best to read his works alone. It's best not to have an interpreter. And as we'll find out, I'm kind of violating Kierkegaard's own, what would we say, his own idea of pursuing the original works of the author rather than interpretation. So I'm going to try not to give too many interpretations and kind of stick to the original words as much as I can, or at least to quote and read from qualified, I guess we could call them qualified authorities on Kierkegaard. It's difficult to even figure out as I'm doing this where to begin. I had to read a lot of Kierkegaard in order to begin to understand him, at least for me to think that I understand him. And it's not so much understand. I think Kierkegaard makes me more aware it's not whether we understand, but it's whether he creates in us the passion to be an individual. The way I'm doing this may seem a little crude and a little rough, but I think that's how it has to be done. I think that if this was too polished, that Kierkegaard would respond angrily. The last thing he would want to do was to hear his words polished and put into a sermon or a sermonette or a review. So I'm not going to attempt to cover anything up. What you see is going to be what you get. I will do my best job to reflect on Kierkegaard. I think one of the best places to begin is one of his books called The Present Age. And we won't really get a full sense of Kierkegaard until we get through several books. But I will start out with The Present Age. I'm not going to read through every word, although it's not a very thick book. I would advise that if you wanted to, you could get a copy of this on Amazon.com pretty cheap. I've got a copy here. It was $1.98. I think most people can afford that. It's pretty tattered now and highlighted, and it's falling apart. But I don't want to throw it away because I've got all my highlights and notes in it. But it's a very thin book, as you can see. There's only, the total book is 108 pages, and that includes an introduction. So we're going to start off with an introduction. This one here is by Harper Torch Books, but any version I'm sure will be fine. Another one that if you really like Kierkegaard, you might want to get the Kierkegaard Anthology, and this is by Robert Bretall, and he covers a number of books that Kierkegaard wrote. Not all of them, because there really are a lot, but he covers the main ones. And this book might be a little bit more expensive, but still, on getting used books on Amazon.com is probably the best way to go. So we'll talk about The Present Age. Some of the things that we're going to find out about Kierkegaard is he kind of uses his own vocabulary. In The Present Age, we'll be talking about the term leveling. I know there is a psychology, an art called leveling, but it's not exactly the same thing. But in Kierkegaard, we'll talk about leveling. We'll talk about the public. We'll talk about the individual. We'll talk about what's called the threefold division here. He divides things up into the antiquity age, which is, the old age, the age where age of Christ would be considered antiquity. But we'll talk about what he calls Christendom, which might be a little different than Christianity. Again, it may take a little while and deeper into his writings before we can grasp the difference. And he'll talk about the present age. I will begin by kind of reading through some of the things that I have highlighted in the Kierkegaard anthology under the present age as our introduction to kind of keep me from wandering off on different subjects. So I'll try to comment on some of the points that he brings up. Kierkegaard was an unpolitical man. He was not involved in politics. He wasn't interested in the politics of his day. He found that the politics of his day was a result of the process of leveling, which we will get into. One of the things that Kierkegaard wants to try to teach us here, or make us aware of, is the difference between the mass, or the public, and the individual. So we'll see his tendency to do that here. The problem he talks about man is he's either lost in the dizziness of unending abstraction, or he's saved forever in the reality of religion. The abstract is another one of the key issues of Kierkegaard. We can see that at work today, probably even more than he could. The whole idea of everything is abstract. There is no truth. There is no real reality, but everything is nothing in a sense. When we talk about anything, we talk about it in abstract terms. And Kierkegaard will give us some reasons why we do that. What's the problem with that? He talks about the chief organ of the public is the press, by which its very nature appeals to humanity's lowest common denominator. Can you see that in the newspapers today, in the stories? But we have the internet now, a great tool, but do you ever read some of the stories that make it, or the stories that make it to the front page? Many stories are really aimed at the lowest level of society, humanity's lowest common denominator. They're meant to not so much make us aware and smarter, but I guess to sell newspapers. The internet is the same way. Eye catchers, women in bikinis, muscle men, whatever it takes to get our attention, to read the article so we can see the commercial, see the advertisement that accompanies it. Not really a reason, or not really using such a technology to its full efficiency for mankind anyway. But again, part of the leveling process to bring everybody down to the lowest level. That's what Kierkegaard is about here. Kierkegaard had his problems with newspapers. The Corsair was a newspaper that at one point in time launched articles against him in ridicule of him, drew cartoons about him, making fun of his looks, his physical peculiarities, his idiosyncrasies, which apparently were many. But they capitalized on that and made his life kind of a living hell in the community, whereas at one time he was a respected man and he enjoyed going out for walks in the community of Copenhagen. But what happened was he became a laughingstock to the public. He could no longer sit in church, no longer walk down the block without people making fun of him. So his life became miserable because of the Corsair. He didn't mind that because, as we'll see, it was part of his plan to educate the public. So the common people became alienated from him and began treating him as an amiable lunatic, according to the preview here. He was one of the first to call attention to the concrete danger of newspapers. Oh, we have freedom of the press, and that's probably a good thing. But we have to ask ourselves the question, has that freedom and that right been abused? The freedom for what? What kinds of things do we read about? What's the value of it? How important is it? Is it shock value today? I keep reading articles in the newspaper that are like that, but now I see it on the internet, and I think instead of the newspapers, we probably, in our conversations, we should talk more about the internet, because that's more worldwide, that's more modern, and I think what Kierkegaard was talking about becomes more prominent in this means of communication, rather than it was and still is in the newspaper. It's still a little bit more subtle in the newspaper, but it's now, I think, more fully blown out in what we see in the internet. He talks about reflection in our age. When I say our age, it means his age, but we can see that today too. But in a sense, you have to understand, Kierkegaard is talking about reflection in a negative sense. In other words, he's talking about our age is essentially one of understanding and reflection without passion. People just want to know the facts. They want to know. They want to have the appearance of knowing, but they don't want the passion of believing it. They don't want the passion that drives them. In other words, in Christianity, knowing Christ, knowing the Bible, knowing things like that is what we would call reflection. Yes, I'm a sinner. That's part of understanding and reflecting on the gospel. But what about the passion that goes with that? What about the passion of being a Christian? Engaging with Christ, accepting the responsibility of being a Christian. That's what Kierkegaard is all about. That's what we're going to find out here in a little bit in the present age. By reflection, Kierkegaard means not the exercise of our intellectual faculties as such, but rather the tendency to feel one's reality as reflected in something external to oneself. Something of a collective nature, the organization. Here's where Kierkegaard now is telling us about the abstract. In other words, it's okay if we become reflective and we think in terms of the abstract in our minds. The problem is abstract removes the responsibility. It becomes whatever we want it to be. It removes the passion from it because there's no such thing as the abstract. It's part of the imagination. It's what we want it to be. Let me read some more now out of the introduction to the present age in our other book here, translated by Alexander Drew. And let's see, we can begin here. Kierkegaard is fine, says the present age, provided only he's cut and dried a little, milked of his unpleasant venom, and in one word, boulderized is the word that they're using here. So the idea is, yeah, we can love Kierkegaard, we can talk about Kierkegaard, the pastor can give sermons about Kierkegaard, as long as we kind of neutralize him, as long as we cut him and dry him, editorialize him, and remove everything unpleasant that he said. Anything confrontational, we don't want confrontation. But that's what Kierkegaard is all about. Confrontation of the self. That's what we'll find here. One betrays with interpretations. That's why I'm afraid what I'm doing here might be kind of against Kierkegaard, so I've got to be careful not to interpret him. Because Kierkegaard was not for interpretation. But interpretation is a way of making something into something else. Taking a book, interpreting it, putting it in your own words was a way of mistranslating it in a sense. So we have to be very careful that we don't take out the venom of Kierkegaard and capture his irony and capture the technique that he uses to get where he wants to go. Simply talking about Kierkegaard isn't good enough. We want to capture the sense of paradox and bounce the ideas of irony and paradox off each other to get the dynamic sense of his passion. Kierkegaard was a passionate writer. To eliminate the passion from his writings, might as well not read it at all. The present day Judases no longer know what they betray any more than they know what they like. What they know is only the preface written by another hand, the lecture given by a parson or a professor, the interpretation of the well-known critic. In other words, people today, knowledge is second-hand or third-hand. It's books about a book about a book. I see this constantly, especially with critics who criticize the gospel, who criticize Jesus. They've read a book that's a bestseller that make these claims about Christ, negative claims about Christ. Well, they don't read the original. It's a book about a book about a book. They don't bother to go into the original because that's just way too much work. It's easier to believe in a simplified form where Jesus is watered down into 3 iterations when what he says is no longer actually what he means. Cults, of course, do this as well. And sometimes we do it. Hopefully we're unaware of doing it. But we want to be aware that it's possible to do it. And hopefully that'll help prevent us from doing it. Much of what Kierkegaard is too often praised for is not really very profound or beautiful, but rather entertaining and amusing. This is the damage that people do to Kierkegaard. They quote Kierkegaard as a matter of amusement or as a matter of entertainment. I've also noticed that people quote Kierkegaard to show their intellectual prowess. Well, I can quote Kierkegaard. Well, big deal. Do you really understand Kierkegaard? That's the issue. Hopefully I don't fall into that category. I have to be aware of it, though. One of his best-known books, Fear and Trembling, is directed in large against those who read the Bible from an aesthetic point of view, admiring Abraham along with the beautiful story which tells of his readiness to sacrifice his son. Here we see the idea that in his book Fear and Trembling, which we'll try to get to a little larger and a little deeper maybe even in this book, but his fear was that people read the Bible from an aesthetic point of view. They don't become engaged or passionate about it, but they read it as a book of stories, little cute little stories. And maybe that's the fault of how we teach the Bible. We begin by teaching little children these are little fairy tales. Adam, Abraham, Noah, these are cute little stories, bedtime stories or what have you. And perhaps we never get rid of that. Maybe that's cemented into our psyche. And it's hard to read the Bible without picturing them as fairy tales. So we also have to become aware of that as we teach Scripture. And as for those of you who are Bible study teachers, you have to become aware of that in the audience. Those people in the Bible study, that's what they're bringing to the study with them. And we have to be understanding, sympathetic, yet we have to still somehow try to crack that cement foundation and implant the idea that these are not just fairy tales, but there's a much deeper meaning behind these tales. Okay, now I'm on page 25 of the present age. So what makes the present age worth reading? Why do we want to read it? What are we going to get out of it? Well, the author here puts it together this way. He says, read for the flavor, chew the phrases, enjoy the humor, feel the offense when you're attacked. Don't ignore the author's blunders, and don't fail to look for your own shortcomings as well. Then the book will make you a better man or woman than you were before. But if you should find it too strenuous to read through the joy and pain of an encounter with a human being who, exasperated with himself, his age, and you, does not, let's face it, like you, then leave the book alone and do not look for marvelous anticipations. You've got to be ready to read Kierkegaard, and ready and want to be improved. This is not just a book to read. It's not just a book of stories or a book to say, oh yeah, he's writing about those people. He's writing about you. He's writing about me. And we have to read it as though we're sitting across from Kierkegaard. He intends for us to be moved by it, to be offended. He wants to offend us with his writing. We have to let him do that. If we let him bring us to where he wants us to, we will find we will become better people, in the sense that we will be able to, I think, understand and comprehend our relationship with God in a much different way, in a much better way. One of the things that he talks about in his book on Fear and Trembling is that what our age, this is his quote, what our age lacks is not reflection, but passion. Again, reiterating the idea that we don't have a passionate age, because passion means you have to believe in what you're talking about. And you have to be engaged in it. You have to commit yourself that you're going to believe and you're going to live what you believe. This is the problem with Christianity today. The problem, not only his day, but our day as well. People don't want to be committed to Christianity. They want it to be and remain a religion, to remain a belief system, an ethical system, something external to me. I don't want to be part of it. I don't mind singing hymns. I don't mind having communion. I don't mind getting baptized and having my children baptized. I don't mind wearing special clothes or hats or crosses. I don't mind that. But what I mind is being passionate. I don't want people to think I really believe this stuff. You know, it's acceptable to wear a cross. It's acceptable to wear certain clothes if you're a pastor. It's acceptable to say certain phrases. It's acceptable to celebrate Easter or to celebrate Christmas. But it's not acceptable to the public to be committed and passionate and preach and teach and try to convert people. That's not acceptable. That's being... what's the word they call it? Having a fever. Too much passion, you become... I can't think of the word. But the thing that this is real. But that's what you risk. We talk about the individual again. that the individual, his protest against his age was centered in his lament over the loss of authority. Kierkegaard will talk about authority and the problem with authority and the fear of man's authority. Man is afraid of authority, so he tries to neutralize authority. By what right do you say that? Who made you the king? You know, all these expressions. Who made you Moses? The idea that we reject authority, carry over from the 60s, of which I am a product of. The idea is we hate authority. The appalling possibility that Kierkegaard insisted we consider was that God's teaching might not agree completely with the predilections and the conscience of the present age. In other words, how dare God tell us what to do? We know better. We're in an enlightened society. The Enlightenment was years ago. We've passed the Enlightenment of the 1800s. You know, we are beyond that. We're in the 21st century. We know what to do. We don't need God to tell us. We don't need to read an Old Testament about some ancient society who primitive and killing animals to sacrifice for sins. We don't need that. We're very enlightened in our society. So how dare God try to teach us what to do? We know what to do. That's the attitude that he's fighting against. If God is really to make a moral difference in our lives, Kierkegaard insists we must admit that he might go against our reason and our conscience, and that he should still be obeyed. We find this is the paradox, and paradox is another term we're going to hear about the irony and paradox. But here's maybe the first paradox, the idea that God might go beyond our reasoning, and he might go beyond what we consider to be ethically proper behavior. Maybe God's got a little different take on what he considers moral and ethical behavior. So that we have to stay open to. All right, let's see if there's anything left in here in our introduction. We talk about the leveling process. But I think we're getting into the text now. So before we get too far into it, let me just kind of try to limit these first sessions to about a half hour. So we'll kind of close this first session off as an introduction. And we'll get a little further into kind of a summary of the text. I'm not going to read the text directly. I think I'll leave that to you. I will kind of cover excerpts of it. Otherwise, this class will be too long. Or this review will be too lengthy. So hopefully I've stimulated you. Hopefully you're going to want to come back and see the next verse, the next version rather of our class. So I'll leave you with that. I'll give you a little time to order your books if you want to do that. And we'll follow up again next with the next lesson. Thanks for coming. I really do appreciate it and hope that you will get something from this. So goodbye and God bless.